There's a moment in American music history that still makes us shudder when we look back on it. In the late 1970s, millions of people listened to steamy love songs about adultery, about illicit affairs in cheap motels. But the people singing those lustful lyrics were not husband and wife, nor lovers. They were a father and his daughter. It was the Kendalls, a combination so bizarre it bordered on taboo, yet became insanely successful. America was mesmerized. They applauded when they saw a father whispering sinful love words into his daughter's ear on national television. This is not a story about art. This is a story about control, about a failed barber in St. Louis who decided that if he couldn't become a star himself, he would cast his daughter as a stage mistress to fulfill his dream of fame. A perfect family drama written with a script of relentless obsession. Royce Kendall was born on September 25, 1934, in St. Louis. Royce wasn't a hobbyist. He was a man who had tasted the life. In the 1950s, long before Jeannie was a glimmer in the charts, Royce and his brother Vern had formed a duo called the Austin Brothers. They were good. They were better than good. They played that hard-driving, high-harmony bluegrass that cuts straight to the bone. They had the ambition of conquerors. They packed up their instruments and headed west to California, the land of milk and honey, chasing the same neon dream that thousands of Dust Bowl refugees had chased before them. They found some success. They played the clubs. They honed their craft. But the big break, the contract that changes your life, the hit that puts your name in lights, never came. The Austin Brothers were a frustrating near miss. And in the music business, a near miss is more painful than a total failure, a failure you can walk away from. A near miss haunts you. It whispers to you that you were this close. Eventually, the reality of life caught up with them. The Austin Brothers disbanded. Royce Kendall did the responsible thing. He moved back to St. Louis. He put away the stage clothes. He picked up a trade. He became a barber. For years, Royce stood behind a chair, clipping hair, shaving necks, making small talk about the weather and the Cardinals. To his customers, he was just Royce, the friendly barber with the easy smile and the steady hand. But inside, the musician was still screaming. He hadn't let go. He was simply biding his time. He kept his guitar nearby. He kept writing songs in his head while he swept the floor. He was a man living a double life, a barber by day, a dreamer by night. And then he noticed something, or rather he heard something. Jeannie Kendall was born on November 30th, 1954. She grew up in the shadow of her father's deferred dream. In the Kendall household, music wasn't a pastime. It was oxygen. It was the language they spoke. From a very young age, Jeannie showed signs of having the gift. But it wasn't just that she could carry a tune. It was the texture of her voice. Even as a young girl, she had a voice that sounded like it had lived 1,000 years. It was high, piercing, and laced with a natural, involuntary vibrato that sounded like a tear falling on a steel guitar string. It was a mountain voice, pure and unfiltered, appearing inexplicably in the suburbs of St. Louis. Royce heard it, and more importantly, he heard how it fit with his own. One afternoon, perhaps while strumming his guitar in the living room, he asked her to sing along. He took the low harmony, the baritone anchor. She took the high lead. The sound that filled the room was electric. It's a phenomenon called blood harmony. The Louvin brothers had it. The Beach Boys had it. Because family members share the same DNA, the same shape of the larynx, the same lung capacity, and the same regional accent. Their voices blend in a way that two strangers can never replicate. When Royce and Jeannie sang together, it didn't sound like two people. It sounded like one instrument with two reeds. For Royce, this must have been a moment of terrifying clarity. He realized that the partner he had been searching for all his life, the partner he had failed to find in California, the partner who could take him back to the promised land, was sitting right there on his living room rug. She was his daughter. She was a teenager, but she was also his ticket out of the barber shop. The dynamic that formed between them in those early years set the template for the rest of their lives. Royce was the architect. Jeannie was the vessel. Royce began to train her. This wasn't a stage father pushing a reluctant child into a pageant. By all accounts, Jeannie loved to sing. She loved the music, but the drive, the strategy, the relentless ambition, that was all Royce. They began to perform locally. They weren't playing glamorous venues. They were playing in living rooms for friends. They were playing at local gatherings. They were testing the waters. But there was an elephant in the room, even then. A father and daughter duo is unusual. In gospel music, it is common. The family band is a staple of the church. The Carter family, the Stonemans, the Happy Goodman family. These were dynasties where generations stood side by side. But Royce didn't want to be a gospel act. He didn't want to be a novelty. He wanted to be a country star. He wanted to sing the hard stuff, the real stuff. And the real stuff in country music is usually about loving, leaving, drinking, and cheating. How do you navigate that minefield with your teenage daughter? In the beginning, they stuck to folk and standard country covers. They were finding their footing, but even then, the contrast was striking. Royce was a handsome older man with a touch of the rogue about him. Jeannie was a striking beauty, with long blonde hair and wide, innocent eyes. Visually, they were arresting. Musically, they were undeniable. But Nashville is a fortress with high walls, and it does not lower the drawbridge easily for a barber from Missouri and his kid. In the late 1960s, when Jeannie was just 15, they made their move. They began traveling to Nashville. Imagine the scene. The drive from St. Louis to Nashville is about 5 hours through the rolling hills of the Midwest and the South. For Royce, every mile must have felt like a reclamation. He was going back to the war, but this time he had a secret weapon. They knocked on doors. They sat in waiting rooms, clutching demo tapes. They played live for anyone who would listen. And they were rejected, repeatedly. The industry didn't know what to do with them. "You're too country," some said. This was the era of countrypolitan, the smooth, string-laden sound of Glenn Campbell and Lynn Anderson. The Kendalls sounded like they had just stepped off a porch in Appalachia in 1930. They were raw. They were loud. They were acoustic. "It's a weird pairing," others whispered. A father and daughter singing love songs. It made the executives uncomfortable. It didn't fit the marketing boxes. Who is the target audience? Is it for families? Is it for honky-tonks? And then there was the age gap. Royce was in his late 30s, pushing 40, ancient in pop music terms. Jeannie was a minor. They were caught in a no man's land. They weren't a solo act. They weren't a husband-wife duo like Johnny Cash and June Carter, and they weren't a band. They were an anomaly. But Royce Kendall possessed the stubbornness of a man who has nothing left to lose. He refused to hear no. He knew that what they had was special. He knew that if he could just get that sound onto a radio wave, the people would decide, not the executives. Their first glimmer of hope came in the early 1970s. They managed to secure a small release with a song called "Stop the World." It was a cover of a song originally made famous by Carl Ballou and later Waylon Jennings. It was a good record. It showcased their harmony perfectly. Jeannie's voice cut through the mix like a diamond drill. It charted. It made a small ripple, but it didn't explode. For a few years, they hovered in the lower rungs of the industry. They were working musicians, but they weren't stars. They released a few singles on small labels like Dot Records. They tried to modernize their sound. They tried to fit in. During this period, Jeannie was growing up. She was transitioning from a teenager into a young woman, and as she did, the dynamic on stage began to shift. She wasn't just the cute kid standing next to her dad anymore. She was becoming a focal point. Her beauty was undeniable. Her voice was maturing, gaining power and depth. Royce, ever the strategist, saw this. He realized that Jeannie was the star. He was the anchor, the harmony, the manager, the father, but she was the one the spotlight loved. He began to step back just an inch, allowing her to take the lead vocal more often, wrapping his voice around hers rather than competing with it. He was grooming her. He was building the Kendalls brand around her charisma, powered by his experience. But they were still missing the key ingredient. They had the voice, they had the look, they had the drive, but they didn't have the song. In country music, the song is God. You can be the greatest singer in the world, but if you don't have the material, you are nothing. They needed a song that would define them, a song that would break down the door. They didn't know it yet, but the song they needed was waiting for them. But it wasn't a hymn. It wasn't a sweet ballad about home. It was a song about sin. As 1976 approached, the Kendalls were at a crossroads. They had been grinding for years. The novelty of their act was wearing off. The industry was moving on to the outlaw movement of Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. They needed a Hail Mary. They signed with a small independent label called Ovation Records. Ovation wasn't RCA or Columbia. It was a scrappy underdog. They didn't have the massive budgets, but they had hunger. They were willing to take risks that the big boys wouldn't touch. Royce and Jeannie went into the studio to record their first album for Ovation. They were looking for material. They were sifting through demos, looking for that spark. And that is when the trap was laid. It wasn't a malicious trap. No one set out to imprison Jeannie Kendall in a golden cage. It was a trap built of success, a prison constructed from a single choice that would define their entire future. They found a song written by Jerry Gillespie. It was catchy. It had a driving acoustic rhythm. It had a melody that hooked you instantly. The lyrics, however, were complicated. Heaven's just a sin away. Oh, it's good because you're good and I'm lonesome. It was a song about temptation. It was a song about a woman standing on the precipice of adultery, looking at a man who wasn't her husband and feeling the magnetic pull of desire. It equated that forbidden pleasure with heaven. For a father and daughter to sing this in 1977, it was a gamble. It bordered on the inappropriate. If they sang it wrong, it would be creepy. If they sang it too earnestly, it would be scandalous. But Royce heard something else. He heard the melody. He heard the space for the harmony. And Jeannie, she just sang it. She sang it with that high, innocent, piercing voice of hers. And that was the magic trick. When Jeannie sang about sin, she didn't sound like a sinner. She sounded like an angel who had lost her way. She sounded innocent. The contrast between the dirty lyrics and the pure voice created a friction, a tension that was irresistible. They recorded the track. They put the harmonies down. They listened to the playback. In that studio, staring at the speakers, Royce Kendall must have known. He must have known that the barbershop was gone forever. He must have known that they had finally caught the lightning. But he couldn't have known the price. He couldn't have known that by singing about heaven being a sin away, they were building a purgatory for his daughter, a career where she would be forever frozen in time, singing about vices she didn't have, bound to a man she couldn't leave, waiting for a freedom that would only come through tragedy. The rocket was on the launch pad. The fuse was lit. The Kendalls were about to conquer the world. August 1977. Elvis Presley died in his bathroom at Graceland, and a nation went into mourning. The king was dead, and the vacuum he left in the cultural consciousness of the South was immense. The music industry was in a state of chaotic transition. The outlaws, Willie, Waylon, and the boys, were rewriting the rules with leather and marijuana. The country politan Smooth Sound was fighting for its life. And into this confused, grieving, turbulent landscape dropped a simple acoustic guitar riff and a voice that sounded like a bluebird singing about adultery. When Ovation Records released Heaven's Just a Sin Away, they didn't have a marketing budget that could compete with RCA or Columbia. They didn't have billboards on Sunset Boulevard. They had a song. They pressed the vinyl, mailed it to the disc jockeys, and waited. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a slow build. It was a wildfire. In radio stations from Tupelo to Tulsa, DJs put the needle on the record, perhaps expecting another generic ballad. What they heard stopped them cold. The intro was sparse, just that driving acoustic guitar devoid of the heavy orchestration that clogged the airwaves. And then Jeannie's voice kicked in. It cut through the static like a laser. It was high, sweet, and undeniably catchy. But it was the lyrics that made listeners turn up the volume. Heaven's just a sin away. It was a phrase that dripped with Southern Gothic tension. It acknowledged the religious framework of the Bible Belt, heaven and sin, but it flipped the morality on its head. It suggested that paradise wasn't found in the pew, but in the forbidden arms of a lover. The phone lines at radio stations lit up. Who is that? Play it again. Is that a choir? It wasn't a choir. It was a barber and his daughter. By the autumn of 1977, the Kendalls were no longer a struggling act looking for a break. They were a phenomenon. The song shot up the charts with a velocity that defied gravity. It bypassed the established stars, Dolly Parton, Kenny Rogers, Loretta Lynn, and claimed the #1 spot on the Billboard country chart. But it didn't stop there. The song was so undeniable, so melodically perfect, that it crossed over. It cracked the Pop Top 100. People who had never set foot in a honky-tonk were humming along to a song about cheating. For Royce Kendall, this moment must have felt like a hallucination. He was 43 years old. He had spent 20 years watching other people succeed. He had swept hair off the floor while dreaming of this specific feeling. Now suddenly, he was standing at the top of the mountain. But for Jeannie, just 22 years old, the experience was disorienting. She had gone from being a local curiosity to a national superstar overnight. She was young, beautiful, and the voice of the biggest song in America. The success of Heaven's Just a Sin Away wasn't just commercial, it was critical. The industry, which had sneered at them just months before, suddenly decided they were geniuses. The Country Music Association, the ultimate gatekeeper of the genre, named Heaven's Just a Sin Away the single of the year. Then came the Grammys. The Recording Academy, often criticized for being out of touch, couldn't ignore them. The Kendalls won the Grammy Award for Best Country Vocal Performance by a duo or group. They beat out legends. They walked onto the stage, the father in his suit and the daughter in her gown, holding the golden gramophone that validated every struggle, every rejection, every mile driven in a cramped car. However, in the flush of victory, the trap began to close. When you have a hit that big, a monster hit in industry parlance, it defines you. It becomes your identity. The public didn't know Royce and Jeannie as the Kendalls, the versatile musicians who can sing folk and gospel. They knew them as the people who sing that cheating song. The label, Ovation, saw the sales figures and came to a logical, cold-blooded conclusion. Sex sells. Sin sells. Do it again. This is the pivotal moment where the artistic trajectory of the Kendalls was frozen in amber. They had stumbled upon a lucrative formula, the contrast between Jeannie's innocent, angelic vocal delivery and lyrics that dealt with illicit romance. Royce, the pragmatic manager, understood the business. He knew that to deviate from the formula now would be suicide. You dance with the one who brought you. So when it came time to record the follow-up singles, they didn't look for songs about tractors or family reunions. They looked for songs about sneaking around. Their next major hits reinforced the narrative with hammer blows. Pittsburgh Steelers. The title was a clever play on the football team, but the song was about two lovers stealing moments together in a city of strangers. Sweet Desire. Another #1 hit. The lyrics were even more explicit in their longing. Sweet desire, you're running through my veins like liquid fire. It don't feel like sinning to me. The title says it all. It was a direct defense of adultery, wrapped in a melody so sweet it could be sung in Sunday school. They were building a catalog that was thematically consistent, commercially potent, and psychologically bizarre. The visual was striking, a protective father harmonizing with his daughter as she gave voice to a burning, illicit desire. To the casual listener, it was just a catchy song. But to the critics, and perhaps to the subconscious of the audience, there was a friction there. It was a taboo element. It wasn't incestuous, the songs weren't about them, but the visual of a father facilitating his daughter's musical seduction of the audience created a unique, uncomfortable energy. It made them memorable. It made them dangerous in a way that Donnie and Marie Osmond never were. While the radio played their hits, the reality of their lives was shrinking. Success in country music means one thing: touring. The Kendalls boarded a tour bus and effectively never got off for the next decade. The bus became their home, their office, and their prison. For Royce, the road was a vindication. He was the boss. He managed the band, handled the money, negotiated with promoters, and steered the ship. He was in his element. He was the patriarch of a traveling kingdom. For Jeannie, the reality was starkly different. She was a young woman in her 20s, the prime of her life, locked in a rolling metal tube with her father and a band of hired musicians. Most young stars in the 1970s were living wild lives. They were partying at Studio 54, dating other celebrities, experimenting with the freedoms of the era. Jeannie Kendall was singing about sweet desire, but her life was one of isolation. She was protected. Royce was a vigilant father. He wasn't a tyrant in the abusive sense. By all accounts, they loved each other deeply and had a genuine bond. But he was a gatekeeper. He protected her from the drugs, the groupies, and the predatory men of the music industry. But in doing so, he also walled her off from her peers. Jeannie didn't have a squad of girlfriends. She didn't have a string of public romances. She had the show, she had the bus, she had her dad. This isolation created a dependency that went beyond the professional. Jeannie's entire world was filtered through Royce. He chose the songs. He approved the outfits. He drove the bus literally and metaphorically. She was the voice, the face, the star, but he was the gravity that held her in orbit. She was becoming a star in a glass box. The audience could see her, they could hear her, they could project their fantasies onto her, but she couldn't touch the world, and the world couldn't touch her. By 1979 and 1980, the Kendalls were an established institution. They were regulars on Hee Haw, the television juggernaut that beamed country culture into millions of homes. They were Grand Ole Opry favorites. They were consistent chart toppers, but artistically, they were painted into a corner. The cheating song brand was a hungry beast. It demanded to be fed. Every time they tried to release a song that deviated from the theme, a gospel track, a standard love song, the radio response was tepid. The audience had been conditioned. They wanted the thrill. They wanted the innocent sinner. This typecasting is a common tragedy in Hollywood, but in music it is more subtle. An actor can change costumes. A singer is the song. Jeannie Kendall was becoming synonymous with the other woman. She was the voice of the mistress, the temptress, the girl who couldn't say no. Yet, in her private life, she was a devout Christian. She was a woman of deep faith. She was a devoted daughter. The dissonance between the character she played on the radio and the woman she was on the bus began to widen. Did it bother her? In interviews from the time, Jeannie was always gracious. She defended the songs. They're just stories, she would say. They're real life. People go through this. She was a professional. She knew that the songs paid the bills. But beneath the surface, there must have been a yearning for something else, a desire to sing about her own truth rather than the fictionalized sins of a character created by songwriters in Nashville office buildings. In the midst of this professional turbulence, a significant shift occurred in Jeannie's private life. She fell in love. Jeannie married Mac Watkins, the band's talented lead guitarist and a man who understood the business inside out. This should have been a moment of liberation. A woman in her late 20s, finally establishing her own household, her own identity separate from her father. But the marriage created a new layer of complexity for the Kendalls brand. On stage, Jeannie was still the eternal daughter. She was still half of the duo. The audience didn't want to see Mrs. Mac Watkins. They wanted to see Jeannie Kendall, the blonde angel, singing about sin next to her dad. Mac Watkins was a supportive husband. He didn't try to pull her off the road. In fact, he joined the team, playing lead guitar in their touring band. This created a fascinating claustrophobic dynamic on the tour bus. You had the father, the daughter, and the husband all living and working in a space smaller than a mobile home. Royce remained the undisputed captain of the ship. Even though Jeannie was a married woman professionally, she deferred to her father. He still picked the songs. He still set the set list. He still negotiated the fees. Mac accepted this hierarchy, likely because he understood that the Kendalls machine paid the bills for everyone. But for Jeannie, this meant her adulthood was bifurcated. At home, she was a wife. On the road, she was a daughter. She never got to be the boss. She never got to be the solo artist, making her own mistakes. She was safe, protected, and employed, but she was not entirely free. By 1984, the momentum was clearly slowing. The hits were stalling in the lower reaches of the top 20. The venues were getting slightly smaller. The urban cowboy fad had died, leaving a hangover in its wake. The industry was waiting for the next big thing. The Kendalls needed a miracle, and amazingly, they found one more. They found a song written by Max D. Barnes and Robert John Jones. It wasn't a cheating song. It wasn't a novelty track. It was a pure, unadulterated love letter to the medium that had made them stars. It was titled, Thank God for the Radio. If Heaven's Just a Sin Away was their introduction, Thank God for the Radio was their elegy. It is widely considered one of the greatest country songs of the 1980s. The lyrics spoke of the power of music to heal a broken heart, of the radio as a companion in the lonely hours of the night. Thank God for the radio when I'm on the road and I got a long way to go. When Jeannie sang it, she wasn't playing the temptress. She was singing as herself. She was singing about the life she had lived for the past decade, the endless highways, the loneliness of the hotel room, the solace found in a melody. Her voice was achingly beautiful, soaring over a lush traditional production that felt timeless. The song resonated deeply with the core country audience. It went to number 1. It was their third and final chart topper. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the Kendalls had reinvented themselves. They had proven they could have a massive hit without singing about adultery. They had proven they were serious artists, but in retrospect, the song feels like a farewell. It was a tribute to the radio, the very force that was slowly beginning to turn its back on them. It was a song about the past, sung by artists who were struggling to find a place in the future. The success of Thank God for the Radio bought them a little more time, but it couldn't stop the inevitable. In 1986, a tidal wave hit Nashville that wiped the slate clean. It was the arrival of the class of '86. Randy Travis released Storms of Life. Steve Earle released Guitar Town. Dwight Yoakam released Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc. This was the neo-traditionalist movement. These young artists were rejecting the pop country of the urban cowboy years, but they were also rejecting the older, established acts of the '70s. They were looking back to Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell for inspiration. They wanted authenticity. On paper, the Kendalls should have fit right in. They were traditionalists. They had harmonies. They were acoustic-based, but perception is everything. To the cool, young crowd listening to Dwight Yoakam, the Kendalls weren't authentic roots music. They were the cheating song people. They were the duo from Hee Haw. They were perceived as square or dated. They were part of the establishment that the new generation was rebelling against. The phone at the booking agency began to ring less often. The radio stations, now obsessed with Randy Travis and Reba McEntire, removed the Kendalls from their heavy rotation playlists. They were dropped by Mercury Records. This is the moment every artist fears. The moment the major label says we don't see a path forward. It is a polite way of saying you are over. Royce Kendall was 52 years old. Jeannie was 32. They were not ready to retire. They had a band to pay. They had a bus to fuel. They had a lifestyle to maintain. When the hits stop, the road changes. When the hits stop, the venues shrink. The coliseums were replaced by state fairs and honky-tonks, but the show had to go on. The Kendalls entered the nostalgia circuit. They were still beloved by a certain demographic, the older fans who remembered 1977. These fans were loyal. They bought tickets. They wanted to hear Heaven's Just a Sin Away and Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Kendalls gave them what they wanted. Night after night, Jeannie put on the sequins and sang the songs of her youth. She sang about being a teenage temptress, even though she was now a married woman in her 30s. She froze herself in time for the audience. Royce managed the decline with dignity, but it must have gnawed at him. He was a proud man. He believed they were still making good music. They signed with smaller independent labels like Step One Records and Lonesome Dove. They released albums. They were good albums. But they fell into the void. The industry had moved on. The Kendalls had been filed under classic country. They were museum exhibits that could still sing. The stress of the decline began to weigh on the family dynamic. The tour bus, once a chariot of victory, became a capsule of frustration. Royce was hustling harder than ever just to keep the wheels turning. He was calling in favors. He was routing tours that zigzagged across the country to pick up a few $1,000s here and there. Jeannie was tired. She had been on the road since she was a teenager. She had never known a normal adult life. She loved the music. That never wavered. But the grind of the B circuit is relentless. The dressing rooms are colder. The sound systems are worse. The drives are longer. And there was Mac, her husband, still playing guitar, still riding the bus. They wanted to build a life, perhaps have a family, but the economics of the band required them to be on the road constantly. If the Kendalls didn't play, nobody got paid. They were trapped on the hamster wheel. They couldn't afford to stop, but running faster wasn't getting them anywhere. By the late 1980s, the Kendalls had become invisible to the mainstream. They were absent from the award shows. They weren't invited to the big televised specials. To the casual observer, they had simply vanished. But they hadn't vanished. They were out there, somewhere on a highway in Iowa or Texas, driving through the night to the next gig. They were keeping the faith. They were harmonizing beautifully in empty rooms and crowded bars. They were professionals. But the silence from Nashville was deafening. The city they had conquered, the city that had given them Grammys and #1 records, had closed its gates. They were on the outside looking in, watching a new generation of stars live the dream that was slowly slipping through their fingers. Royce Kendall refused to accept defeat. He believed that one more song, one more break could turn it around. He kept looking for material. He kept pushing Jeannie to sing better, harder. He was a captain who refused to abandon the ship even as it took on water. He didn't know that the ship wasn't going to sink. It was going to crash. And the crash wouldn't come from the industry. It wouldn't come from the radio. It would come from the one thing he couldn't control, his own heart. The 1990s were approaching. The final act of the Kendalls was about to begin. It would be a decade of struggle, of resilience, and ultimately of a tragedy that would shatter the duo forever, leaving Jeannie to face the spotlight without the only partner she had ever known. As the 1990s dawned, the landscape of American country music underwent a schism that was as physical as it was cultural. Nashville, now firmly in the grip of the corporate new country machine, led by Garth Brooks and Shania Twain, had effectively served eviction notices to the legends of the past. The radio waves were reserved for the young, the hat-wearing, and the pop crossover stars. The door that had slammed shut on the Kendalls in 1986 was now bolted and barred. But nature abhors a vacuum, and capitalism abhors wasted assets. There was still a massive audience in America, older, rural, fiercely loyal, who didn't care about pyrotechnics or music videos. They wanted to hear the songs they fell in love with in 1977. They wanted the steel guitar. They wanted the harmonies. And if Nashville wouldn't host them, a small town in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri would. Branson became the Alamo for the exiled royalty of country music. It started as a trickle and became a flood. Mel Tillis, Boxcar Willie, Mickey Gilley, and the Oak Ridge Boys built theaters along Highway 76. They created a neon oasis where the clock stopped in 1980. For the Kendalls, Branson wasn't just an opportunity. It was a lifeline. They didn't build their own theater. That required capital they didn't have. But they became fixtures on the circuit. They played the matinees. They played the evening shows. The grueling travel of the road was replaced by a different kind of grind, the static repetition of the residency. For Royce, this was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it was steady money. The buses of retirees rolled in by the thousands, and they bought tickets. On the other hand, playing Branson was a tacit admission of defeat in the current marketplace. It was an acknowledgement that you were now a nostalgia act, a living museum exhibit. You weren't creating the future anymore. You were curating the past. For Jeannie, the Branson years were a strange kind of stasis. She was in her late 30s, still beautiful, her voice as crystalline as ever. But in the context of Branson, she was trapped in amber. She walked out on stage every day at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m., smiled the same smile, told the same jokes, and sang "Heaven's Just a Sin Away" to an audience that mouthed the words along with her. It was a gilded cage. She was a star, yes, but a star in a snow globe. The outside world of music was evolving, shifting, and changing. But inside the theater, it was always 1977. While they made their living on the nostalgia circuit, Royce Kendall refused to let the recording artist in him die. He was stubborn. He believed with a fierce and almost tragic conviction that if they could just get the right song to the right people, they could break back into the mainstream. They spent the 1990s recording for independent labels like Step One Records and Lonesome Dove. These were small operations, run by true believers who loved traditional country music but lacked the distribution muscle to fight the major labels. The tragedy of the Kendalls in the 90s is not that they made bad music, it is that they made great music that no one heard. Albums like Make a Dance showcased a duo that had matured. Jeannie's voice had deepened, exchanging the girlish, breathless quality of her youth for a soulful, bluesy resonance. They were singing with more emotion, more precision, and more power than they had in their prime. But the industry was deaf. They would release a single and it would die at number 70 on the charts or not chart at all. They would send packages to radio stations and the CDs would end up in the trash bin, unopened. The cheating song stigma was still there, hanging over them like a dark cloud, but now it was compounded by ageism. Radio programmers didn't want to play a father-daughter duo in their 60s and 40s. It wasn't cool. This period was a psychological war of attrition for Royce. He was the manager. He was the one making the calls, begging for airtime, trying to leverage old friendships. Every rejection was a personal insult. He watched lesser talents skyrocket to fame while his daughter, who he believed was the greatest singer in the world, was ignored. Jeannie watched her father fight these battles. She saw the toll it took on his heart. She saw the frustration etched in his face when a promising deal fell through or a show was canceled. She carried the guilt of the child who knows her parent is sacrificing his peace for her future, but she was powerless to stop him. She couldn't tell him to give up because the Kendalls was all he was. It was his identity. To stop fighting would be to accept that he was just a barber again. As the decade wore on, the visual dynamic of the Kendalls became increasingly poignant. In 1977, the image of the protective father and the innocent teenage daughter was charming. In 1997, it was complex. Royce was now in his 60s, his hair gray, his face lined with the miles of the road. Jeannie was a woman in her 40s. Yet, on stage, they had to maintain the illusion. They couldn't change the act. The audience didn't want to see them evolve. They wanted the cheating song duo. So, Jeannie stood there, a grown woman with a husband of her own, singing about teenage crushes and illicit affairs, while her elderly father harmonized about forbidden passion. There was a cognitive dissonance to it. It highlighted the artifice of their entire career. They were playing characters. They were actors in a play that had been running for 20 years, and like actors in a long-running Broadway show, they were professional enough to make it look fresh every night, even if they could do it in their sleep. But beneath the surface, Jeannie was beginning to disappear. She had no solo identity. She had no public persona separate from Royce. She was the Kendalls girl. Even her marriage to Mac was subsumed by the entity of the band. Mac wasn't just her husband. He was an employee of the enterprise Royce ran. Their vacations, their finances, their schedule. Everything was dictated by the needs of the duo. Jeannie was a woman who had never truly left home. She had simply taken home with her on a bus for 2 decades. By 1998, the nostalgia boom in Branson was beginning to cool. The market was oversaturated. The Kendalls, ever the road warriors, decided to go back to what they knew best, the touring circuit. They booked a run of shows in the Midwest. It wasn't a glamorous tour. They weren't playing arenas. They were playing county fairs, casinos, and small auditoriums. It was the blue-collar tour. It was about paying the bills and keeping the lights on. Royce was 63 years old. In modern terms, that is not ancient, but 63 in road years is different. Royce had been smoking, stressing, and eating diner food for 40 years. His body was the ledger where the costs of the music business were recorded. He was tired. Friends noticed he was slowing down. He complained of indigestion, of fatigue, but Royce Kendall didn't cancel shows. That was the cardinal rule of the old school. If you can stand, you play. If you can't stand, you sit on a stool and play. You don't leave money on the table. He was driven by a sense of urgency. Perhaps he sensed his mortality. Perhaps he wanted to secure one last big payday for Jeannie before he bowed out. He was pushing for a new album. He was talking about new promotional strategies. He was looking for the next Heaven's Just a Sin Away. He was a man running a race against a sunset he refused to acknowledge. May 22nd, 1998. The Kendalls were on the road. They were in the middle of a swing through the upper Midwest. They had played a show the night before. They were traveling toward their next gig, a performance scheduled for that evening in Wisconsin. The day began like thousands of other days in their history. The hum of the bus engine, the landscape rolling by the window, cornfields, silos, the unending gray ribbon of the highway. Inside the bus, the routine was established. Coffee, silence, a little conversation about the set list, a check of the map. They stopped in Maquoketa, Iowa. It was just a waypoint, a place to stretch their legs, maybe get some food. Royce was in good spirits. He was always the optimist on the road. The show that night was sold out, or close to it. The fans were waiting, but then the shadow fell. It happened quickly. There was no long, drawn-out hospital stay. There were no bedside farewells. Nature, in its terrifying efficiency, simply flipped a switch. Royce collapsed. The chaos that followed is the kind of trauma that stays etched in the mind forever. The panic on the bus, the frantic calls for help. Jeannie stood watching as the man who had been her father, her boss, her partner, and her world was suddenly reduced to a fragile body in distress. Paramedics arrived. They worked on him. They rushed him to the Jackson County Public Hospital. Jeannie followed. Mac followed. The band waited, stunned, in the parking lot. In the sterile light of the emergency room, the doctors gave the news that ends the world. It was a massive stroke. Royce Kendall was dead. He was 63. He died in his boots on the road, doing exactly what he had done every day of his adult life. The show in Wisconsin was canceled. For the first time in 28 years, the Kendalls did not take the stage. The bus ride back to Nashville was a journey through the underworld. It is impossible to imagine the silence on that vehicle. The seat where Royce usually sat, checking the receipts, smoking a cigarette, planning the next move, was empty. For Jeannie, the shock was total. She wasn't just a daughter grieving a father. She was a soldier whose general had just been killed on the battlefield. She was an astronaut whose tether to the ship had been cut. Everything she was, her career, her daily routine, her income, her identity, was wrapped up in the man who was now lying in a casket in the cargo hold or being transported by a hearse. The Kendalls ceased to exist at 1 p.m. on May 22, 1998. There could be no replacement. This wasn't a band where you could hire a new drummer. The act was the chemistry. It was the blood harmony. Without Royce's baritone, Jeannie's high tenor had nothing to lean on. Without Royce's stage presence, Jeannie was just a singer with a microphone. When the news hit Nashville, the reaction was respectful but distant. The industry issued its press releases. Country legend dies. Voice of Heaven's Just a Sin Away. Passes. They played the hits on the radio for a day. They eulogized Royce as a pioneer of the independent scene. They praised his harmonies. But then the machinery moved on. The CMA Awards didn't stop. The charts didn't freeze. The new stars, Faith Hill, Tim McGraw, kept selling millions. Jeannie found herself in the position of every widow of the industry, though she was a daughter. The phone stopped ringing. The bookings evaporated. The machine that Royce had kept running through sheer force of will ground to a halt. She was 43 years old. She had spent her entire adult life in a duet. She had never released a solo single. She had never booked a show by herself. She had never chosen a song without Royce's approval. She was alone in a house that was too quiet, with a husband who had always been the third wheel in the creative partnership. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a solo star. She saw half of a whole that had been ripped apart. In the months that followed, Jeannie fell into a deep, paralyzing grief. It wasn't just sadness, it was a loss of function. She described feeling like she had lost a limb. When she opened her mouth to sing, she instinctively waited for the low harmony to come in. When it didn't, the silence was deafening. She tried to listen to their old records, but it was too painful. Hearing Royce's voice was like being haunted by a ghost who was still trying to harmonize with her. The cheating song legacy now took on a macabre twist. Those songs about secrets, about two people against the world, now felt like elegies for a partnership that was gone. The lyrics about heaven being a sin away now felt cruel. Heaven had taken her partner, and she was left in the sinful world, alone. The industry, in its cold pragmatism, wrote her off. "The Kendalls are done," they said. "Jeannie can't make it on her own. She's too old. She's too country. She's a harmony singer." They underestimated her, or perhaps they just didn't understand the nature of the training she had received. Royce hadn't just taught her how to sing harmony. He had taught her how to survive. He had taught her that the show must go on, even when your heart is breaking. But survival would require a reinvention so total, so painful, that it would take years to achieve. Jeannie Kendall was about to enter the wilderness. She would have to learn who she was when the daddy's little girl persona was stripped away by death. She would have to find out if her voice, that high, lonesome, beautiful voice, could stand on its own without the anchor that had held it down for 30 years. The duo was dead. The woman was just beginning to be born. But the birth would be a long, hard labor. The funeral of Royce Kendall was over. The flowers had wilted on the grave in St. Louis. The condolences from the music industry, written on official letterhead, had been read and filed away. The tour bus, once the humming vessel of their livelihood, sat parked and silent, a metal beast hibernating in the driveway. For Jeannie Kendall, the summer of 1998 was a season of profound disorientation. At 43, she was experiencing a belated coming of age that was brutal in its swiftness. Most people separate from their parents in their late teens or early 20s. They move out, they get jobs, they make mistakes, and they forge an identity distinct from their lineage. Jeannie had never done this. Her separation from her father was not a gradual drifting apart. It was a violent amputation. She woke up every morning in a house that felt too large. She walked past the guitars that Royce would never tune again. She looked at the calendar on the wall, filled with dates that were now crossed out in red ink. Canceled, canceled, canceled. The silence was the hardest part. For 30 years, her life had been a constant feedback loop of sound. The roar of the bus engine, the applause of the crowd, the scratchy monitors on stage, and above all, the baritone voice of her father guiding, correcting, and harmonizing. Now the feedback loop was broken. She tried to sing around the house just to keep the instrument limber, but the sound of her own voice terrified her. Without the low end of Royce's harmony to anchor it, her high tenor felt thin, exposed, and lonely. It was like a kite with no string flailing in the wind. She realized with a sinking heart that she didn't know if she was a singer anymore. She knew she was a Kendall. But what was a Kendall in the singular? While Jeannie wrestled with her ghosts, the music industry made its cold calculations. In Nashville, a deceased artist is a commodity to be repackaged, a greatest hits album, a memorial segment on an awards show. But a surviving partner is a liability. The phone, which had rung incessantly for decades, stopped. The booking agents, who had been so friendly when Royce was alive to sign the contracts, suddenly became elusive. "We love Jeannie," they would say to intermediaries. "But what is the show? Is it just her? Does she have a band? Is she going to sing the hits? It's sad, but the market, that abstract, merciless God that Royce had spent his life trying to appease. The market decided that Jeannie Kendall was a nostalgia act with a missing piece. She was treated like a car with 3 wheels. Interesting to look at, but you couldn't drive it anywhere. Jeannie felt the sting of this abandonment. She had spent her life being the voice of the duo, the pretty face, the star power. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that this carried some weight. She learned quickly that in the music business, power doesn't reside in the voice. It resides in the leverage. And with Royce gone, she had no leverage. In this vacuum, Mac Watkins stepped forward. For years, Mac had been the quiet third wheel of the operation. He was Jeannie's husband, yes, but on the road, he was the lead guitarist, an employee of his father-in-law. He had accepted his place in the hierarchy with grace, knowing that the Kendalls dynamic was sacred. Now, with the patriarch gone, Mac found himself in a new role. He had to be the manager, the producer, and the emotional support system for a wife who was shattering. He didn't try to be Royce, no one could, but he offered a different kind of strength. He encouraged her. He picked up the guitar and started playing the old songs, forcing her to sing along, forcing her to hear her voice filling the room again. "You're not done, Jeannie," he would tell her. "The voice is still there. God didn't take the voice." It was Mac who suggested they reach out to Rounder Records. Rounder Records was an anomaly in the music business. Based in Massachusetts, far from the slick corporate boardrooms of Music Row, Rounder specialized in roots music. They released bluegrass, folk, and Americana. They didn't care about image. They didn't care if you were 43 or 83. They cared about authenticity. They had long admired the Kendalls, not for the cheating songs gimmicks, but for the raw, high lonesome sound that underpinned them. They saw Jeannie not as a washed-up pop country star, but as a legitimate bluegrass vocalist who had been trapped in a commercial box. When the meeting was set, Jeannie was terrified. She hadn't negotiated a deal in her life. Royce had always done the talking, but when she walked into the room, she found something she hadn't expected: respect. Ken Irwin, one of the founders of Rounder, didn't ask her about her demographic appeal. He asked her what she wanted to sing. "I want to sing the music my daddy loved," she said. "I want to sing the real stuff, bluegrass, acoustic, the music we started with before the hits." It was a full circle moment. The barber from St. Louis had started with bluegrass in the Austin Brothers. He had abandoned it to chase the country charts. Now, his daughter was returning to the source to find herself. A deal was signed. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar contract. It was a modest agreement to make an album. But for Jeannie, it was a lifeline. It was proof that she existed. Entering the studio to record her first solo album, simply titled Jeannie Kendall, was a psychological ordeal. The studio is a place of ghosts. It is a sealed environment where every breath, every mistake, every nuance is magnified. Jeannie stood in the vocal booth, the headphones over her ears, and looked through the glass. For 30 years, Royce had been on the other side of that glass, giving her the thumbs up, telling her to punch in a line, guiding the ship. Now the chair was empty, or rather it was filled by strangers, producers, engineers, who were kind, but who weren't him. The first few takes were shaky. Her voice wavered. She was looking for the harmony that wasn't there. But then the band started to play. Rounder had assembled the A-team of acoustic musicians. These weren't the slick Nashville session cats who played perfectly polished licks. These were pickers who played with dirt and soul. The sound of the mandolin, the fiddle, the acoustic guitar. It was the sound of her childhood living room. Jeannie closed her eyes and let the training take over. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was different. It was deeper. It was sadder. The little girl breathless quality was gone, replaced by the rich, resonant timbre of a woman who has walked through the valley of the shadow of death. She recorded Train of Thought. She recorded I Wonder Where You Are Tonight. These were classic songs, songs that required a voice that could cut through stone. And she nailed them. Word got out in Nashville that Jeannie Kendall was recording again. The industry executives might have written her off, but the artist hadn't. Alan Jackson, one of the biggest stars in the world at the time, heard about the project. Jackson was a neo-traditionalist, a man who worshipped the history of the genre. He had grown up listening to the Kendalls. To him, Jeannie wasn't a relic. She was royalty. He reached out. He wanted to be part of it. For Jeannie, this was a massive validation. Alan Jackson didn't need to help her. He was selling out stadiums. He was doing it out of respect. They decided to record a duet. They chose Timeless and True Love, a song the Kendalls had recorded years earlier. On the day of the session, the atmosphere in the studio was electric. Alan Jackson, the tall, quiet superstar in the cowboy hat, stood next to Jeannie Kendall. When they began to sing, something magical happened. Jackson's voice, a rich, warm baritone, slid into the space that Royce had vacated. It wasn't the same. No one could replace Royce, but it worked. It was a different kind of chemistry. It was the sound of the new generation bowing to the old. It was a bridge. When the track was finished, Jeannie wept. It was the first time in 4 years she had felt the power of a duet partner lifting her up. It was proof that she could still create magic, that her voice still had a place in the conversation. But the emotional centerpiece of the album was a song that required a different kind of courage. During the archiving of Royce's materials after his death, they had found a tape. It was a rough recording, a demo of a song called Make a Dance. It was a song Royce had loved, a song he had been working on just before he died. The vocal track was isolated. It was Royce, singing lead. His voice was older, a little rough around the edges, but filled with that unmistakable Kendall character. The producers at Rounder had an idea. It was a risky idea, one that could easily veer into exploitation if not handled with extreme care. They suggested building a new track around Royce's vocal and having Jeannie sing harmony with him one last time. Jeannie hesitated. Was it right? Was it macabre to sing with a dead man? But then she listened to the lyrics. Make a Dance was a song about joy, about seizing the moment, about the beauty of life. It wasn't a sad song, it was a celebration. She agreed. The day she recorded her vocals for Make a Dance was the hardest day of her professional life. She put on the headphones. The engineer pressed play, and there he was. Royce's voice filled her ears, as clear and present as if he were standing right next to her. Come on, Jeannie, he seemed to say. Let's do this one more time. She had to sing the harmony. She had to weave her voice around his, anticipating his phrasing, locking into his rhythm. It was a dance with a ghost. She closed her eyes and let the muscle memory take over. She felt his breath in the pauses. She felt the dip in his voice on the low notes. For 3 minutes, the timeline collapsed. He wasn't dead. He was there. They were the Kendalls. Again, they were father and daughter doing what they were born to do. When the song ended and the fader slid down to silence, the studio was absolutely still. There wasn't a dry eye in the control room. Jeannie took off the headphones and sat in the silence, feeling a profound sense of peace. She had said goodbye, not at a graveside, but in a song. The album Jeannie Kendall was released in 2003. The critical reception was rapturous. The reviews were the best of her career. Critics who had dismissed the Kendalls as a cheating song, novelty act were suddenly stunned by the depth and purity of Jeannie's voice. They praised the acoustic production. They praised the raw emotion. The Washington Post, Billboard, USA Today, they all hailed it as a triumphant return. They called it bluegrass soul. They called Jeannie a national treasure. But radio? Radio was silent. The single Timeless and True Love with Alan Jackson received some airplay on Americana stations, but mainstream country radio ignored it. They were busy playing Toby Keith and Kenny Chesney. They didn't have room for a 49-year-old widow singing acoustic ballads, even if Alan Jackson was on the track. The album sold respectfully to the loyal fan base, but it didn't ignite a comeback in the commercial sense. It didn't put Jeannie back in the arenas. It didn't get her back on the CMA Awards stage. To the industry, the album was a nice legacy project, a tombstone for the career. But for Jeannie, it was a resurrection. It proved that she could exist outside of the duo. It gave her a repertoire that she could sing solo. It gave her the confidence to step back onto the stage. Armed with the new album, Jeannie went back on the road, but it was a different road now. She wasn't playing the nostalgia package tours with the full electric band. She was playing bluegrass festivals. She was playing listening rooms. She was playing theaters where the audience sat in silence and listened to every note. She toured with a small acoustic band. Mac played guitar. They stripped the songs down. Heaven's Just a Sin Away was no longer a pop country anthem. It was played as a bluegrass stomp, fast and high and lonesome. Jeannie found that she loved this new format. Without the drums and the electric guitars drowning her out, she could really sing. She could use the full dynamics of her voice. She could tell stories between the songs. She began to talk to the audience about Royce. She told them funny stories about the bus. She told them about his stubbornness, his talent. She turned the show into a tribute, but not a mournful one. She made Royce a character in the show, keeping his memory alive through storytelling. The audiences loved it. They saw a woman who had survived the fire and come out the other side with her spirit intact. They saw the angel of 1977 grown up into a wise, soulful survivor. However, the shadow of the cheating song era never fully lifted. Even as she garnered respect in the bluegrass world, the general public still wanted the hits. Promoters would book her for casinos, and the contract would stipulate that she had to play the old hits. Jeannie obliged. She was a professional, but there was always a disconnect. Singing Teach Me to Cheat as a widow in her 50s felt almost surreal. The song belonged to a different person, a different lifetime. She performed it with a wink, acknowledging the absurdity of it, but the audience didn't always get the joke. They just wanted to sing along. Jeannie was living in two timelines simultaneously. In the present, she was an acoustic artist finding her soul. In the past, she was the frozen image of the blonde girl next to her father. This duality was exhausting. It required her to constantly code switch between the artist she wanted to be and the star the public remembered. As the mid-2000s approached, Jeannie felt a sense of unfinished business. She had proved she could sing, she had proved she could record, but she was still lonely. The music business is a social ecosystem. When you are a duo, you are a tribe of two. When you are a solo artist, you are an island. Jeannie missed the camaraderie. She missed the feeling of belonging to a family. She began to look for ways to expand her circle. She collaborated with other artists. She appeared on albums by bluegrass legends like Rhonda Vincent. She was seeking a new musical family to replace the one she had lost. But deep down, she knew that nothing could replace the magic of the blood harmony. That was a biological accident, a gift from God that couldn't be manufactured. She had had it for 30 years, and now it was gone. She would spend the rest of her life chasing the echo of that sound, knowing she would never quite catch it again. She was a survivor, yes. But she was also a woman walking with a permanent limp in her soul. She'd escaped the trap of the cheating song duo, only to find herself in the open wilderness of solitude. And as she looked toward the future, she wondered if the world had any place left for a Kendall who walked alone. Despite the artistic triumph of her acoustic comeback, the industry's memory was short. As 2004 rolled into 2005, the critical buzz began to dissipate. The reviews were framed on the wall, but they didn't compel radio program directors to play the music. Refusing to go quietly into the night, Jeannie made a bold, perhaps desperate, pivot. In 2005, she released another album titled All the Girls I Am. If the 2003 album was a return to her roots, this new project was a frantic attempt to show her branches. It was eclectic, shifting from pop to rock to country. It was an album designed to scream, "Look at what else I can do." It was a declaration of independence, a statement that she was more than just a bluegrass harmony singer. But the audience didn't want independence. They didn't want versatility. They wanted the Kendalls. The album was released on a small, obscure independent label. It received little promotion. The distribution was spotty. It didn't just fail to chart, it vanished. To the die-hard fans who had loved the acoustic purity of her previous record, the stylistic shifts felt confusing. To the mainstream, it was non-existent. For Jeannie, this failure was more painful than the rejection of the 90s. In the 90s, she could blame the industry's bias against the duo. Now she had to face the possibility that the world simply wasn't interested in Jeannie Kendall as a solo entity, no matter what style she sang. She had thrown everything she had at the wall, her heart, her versatility, her songwriting, and nothing had stuck. She was learning the brutal lesson of branding. Royce had built a brand so specific, so powerful, the father-daughter, cheating song, acoustic harmony duo, that it had become a prison. The audience couldn't hear her voice without waiting for his. When she deviated from the script, they simply changed the channel. With the recording career stalled, Jeannie and her husband, Mac Watkins, turned back to the only thing that had ever reliably put food on the table, the road. But the road had changed. The glamorous theaters and the coliseums were gone. The new country acts had taken over the arenas. The legends of the 70s and 80s were pushed into a different ecosystem, the casino circuit. By 2008, the venues hadn't changed, but the loneliness had deepened. The casino showrooms were still filled with loyal fans seeking a time machine back to 1977. But for Jeannie, serving as the curator of these memories was becoming a heavier burden. She was no longer just maintaining a career. She was performing a nightly seance for a ghost. She would walk onto the stage, dressed in sequins that caught the artificial light, and she would smile that bright professional smile that Royce had taught her to wear like armor. Mac would count off the beat, and the band would launch into the opening riff of Pittsburgh Steelers. It was a job. It paid the bills. But psychologically, it was a form of entrapment. On stage, the cognitive dissonance grew sharper. She was a grieving woman in her 50s, yet contractually bound to sing about teenage lust and illicit affairs. The provocative edge of 1977 had faded into a strange, wholesome nostalgia, leaving Jeannie to perform as a ghost of her younger self night after night. Jeannie performed these songs with professionalism, but one has to wonder what went through her mind as she sang, "I'd like to sleep till 10 and read the news for the 10,000th time." Did she feel like an imposter in her own history? Did she feel like a cover band of herself? In these twilight years, Mac Watkins became the only gravity holding Jeannie's world together. The expansive entourage was gone. It was just the two of them in a van, hauling their own gear. Mac absorbed the logistical nightmares and the silent humiliations of the casino circuit, so Jeannie wouldn't have to. He was no longer just the guitarist. He was a soldier in the bunker, fighting a daily war to keep his wife's legacy alive. They were a team of two, united against a world that was ready to forget them. They shared the financial anxieties, the physical exhaustion, and the silent burden of Jeannie's chronic grief. It was a partnership forged not in glamour, but in survival. But the strain was immense. They were together 24 hours a day. They shared the financial anxieties of a drying income stream. They shared the physical exhaustion of the road. And they shared the unspoken burden of Jeannie's grief, which had evolved from sharp pain into a chronic low-grade depression. Mac watched his wife struggle to find her place. He saw the indignities of the nostalgia circuit, the dressing rooms that were essentially broom closets, the billing below puppet shows or tribute acts. He absorbed her anger so she could remain the gracious star. He was the silent partner in a business that was slowly going bankrupt, not financially, but spiritually. As the 2000s arrived, a new silence fell. The physical records that held their legacy were disappearing, replaced by a digital world where the Kendalls were ghosts. Without a major label to curate their history, their catalog simply vanished from the new streaming services. Jeannie was witnessing her own erasure in real time. In May 2010, the Cumberland River overflowed its banks. The Great Nashville Flood devastated the city. It drowned the Grand Ole Opry House. It destroyed instruments, archives, and homes. While Jeannie lived outside the worst of the flood zones, the event served as a grim metaphor for her existence. The floodwaters washed away history. They destroyed the physical evidence of the past. For the country music community, it was a wake-up call about the fragility of their heritage. But for Jeannie, it was just another day. She had been feeling the waters rising around her for years, the flood of indifference, the flood of time. She saw her peers, the women she had shared charts with in the 70s, disappearing. Some died, some retired, some simply stopped picking up the phone. The sisterhood of the road was thinning out. She found herself attending more funerals than weddings. She stood by gravesides just as she had stood by Royce's, and watched the earth swallow the only people who remembered the glory days. One of the most exhausting aspects of Jeannie's life during this period was her interaction with the fans. After the shows at the casinos or the fairs, Jeannie would go to the merchandise table. This is the unglamorous reality of the legacy artist. You have to sell the CDs yourself. You have to sign the autographs. You have to shake the hands. The fans who lined up were loyal. They were loving, but they were also vessels of grief. Every night, Jeannie had to hear the stories. I loved your daddy. I remember when you and Royce played the county fair in 1982. I played Heaven's Just a Sin Away at my husband's funeral. They meant well. They wanted to connect. But for Jeannie, it was a nightly ritual of ripping off the scab. She had to comfort them. She had to smile and say, yes, Daddy was wonderful. Yes, we miss him. She had to perform the role of the grieving daughter over and over again, 12 years, 14 years after the fact. She became a vessel for their nostalgia. They projected their own lost youth onto her. They looked at her and saw the 1977 Jeannie, and in doing so, they refused to let her be the 2010 Jeannie. This emotional labor is a heavy tax. It drains the spirit. It requires a dissociation, a splitting of the self. Jeannie learned to put up a wall, a pleasant, smiling, God bless you wall, behind which she could protect the fragile reality of her own life. She was selling memories, but the cost of inventory was her own peace of mind. There was also the physical reality of the instrument. Jeannie Kendall's voice was a high, lonesome instrument. It relied on power, on clarity, on hitting those stratospheric notes that made the harmonies ring. But voices age. The vocal cords lose elasticity. The breath support weakens. For a singer whose entire brand was built on a youthful, piercing sound, aging is a terrifying prospect. Jeannie fought against it. She took care of herself. She didn't smoke. She didn't drink to excess. She protected the instrument with the ferocity of a guard dog. But there were nights when the high notes were harder to reach. There were nights when the fatigue of the road settled in her throat. She had to learn to adjust, to change the keys, to rely on technique rather than raw power. She lived in fear of the day the voice would fail. If she couldn't sing like Jeannie Kendall, who was she? She had no other skills. She had no other career. She had no children to distract her. The voice was her only currency, and inflation was eating away at its value. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Jeannie's life in the 2000s was the absence of a successor. The Kendalls were a family band. Royce had passed the torch to Jeannie, but Jeannie had no one to pass it to. She and Mac had no children. There was no Jeannie Kendall Jr. waiting in the wings to sing the high harmony. The line ended with her. She was the custodian of a legacy that had no heir. When she stopped singing, the songs would stop being sung live. The stories would stop being told. The specific magic of the Kendall sound would be extinguished. This realization adds a layer of existential weight to her perseverance. She wasn't just working for herself. She was keeping the flame alive because there was no one else to hold the candle. She was the last of the Mohicans in her own private universe. This solitude created a fierce urgency in her performances. When she sang "Thank God for the Radio," it wasn't just a song anymore. It was a prayer. She was thanking God that the signal was still going out, that someone was still listening, because she knew that silence was waiting at the end of the broadcast. They were entering the twilight of their professional lives. The industry had moved on so completely that they were no longer even part of the conversation. They were existing in a parallel universe, performing for an audience that was aging along with them. But in that twilight, there was a certain dignity. They had survived. They hadn't succumbed to drugs. They hadn't gone bankrupt. They hadn't divorced. They had navigated the minefield of the music business and come out scarred but standing. Jeannie Kendall was still standing at the microphone, clutching it like a lifeline. She was still closing her eyes and finding the note. She was still waiting for the ghost of her father to join her in the chorus. She didn't know that one final devastating blow was waiting for her. She didn't know that the solitude she felt now was only a prelude. In the autumn of 2013, the final pillar of Jeannie's life collapsed. Mac Watkins, the man who had stood stoically in the background for decades, passed away on September 23rd after suffering a severe stroke. The devastation of this loss is difficult to quantify. When a woman loses her father, she loses her past. When she loses her husband, she loses her present. Jeannie Kendall had now lost both. The symmetry of the tragedy was cruel. She had spent the first half of her life defined by Royce, and the second half sustained by Mac. Now, for the first time in her entire existence, there was no man standing to her left or right. There was no one to tune the guitar. There was no one to drive the van. Most people would have retired. The industry certainly expected her to. What is a Kendall without the harmony? What is a touring act without a band leader? But Jeannie Kendall did the only thing she knew how to do. She kept working. By 2016, even with new bandmates, the world around Jeannie Kendall felt like it had shrunk. Her universe was defined by the radius of the next gig and the four walls of her home. Within this shrinking world, the absence of her father and husband was not merely a loss, it was a vacuum. She began to take the stage alone. Picture the scene in a small theater in rural Tennessee or a casino lounge in Mississippi in 2018. The lights go down. The announcer says, "Please Welcome, Jeannie Kendall. She walks out. She is older now. The blonde hair is still there. The smile is still professional, but there is a fragility in her posture. She stands at the microphone, clutching it with both hands. When the band, hired guns, local musicians, starts the intro to Heaven's Just a Sin Away, the audience cheers. They are cheering for the memory of 1977. Jeannie starts to sing. The voice is still there, that miraculous tear-stained instrument. But when the chorus hits, the moment where Royce's baritone used to slide underneath her vocal like a velvet cushion, there is nothing, just empty air. Sometimes a band member tries to fill it in. Sometimes she lets the audience sing the low part. But often she just sings the lead, leaving the harmony implied, a ghost note that only she can hear. To watch her perform in these years was to witness a public act of mourning. She wasn't just entertaining the crowd. She was keeping a vigil. She was keeping the name the Kendalls alive, even though the plural noun was now a lie. The psychological conditioning of Jeannie's life, the decades spent in a duo, meant that she was uncomfortable existing as a solo entity. She craved the binary dynamic. She needed a counterweight. This complicated legacy is the primary reason why the Kendalls are not in the Country Music Hall of Fame. Statistically, they deserve to be there. They had 3 #1 hits, 20 top 40 singles, and a Grammy. But the Hall of Fame is not just about statistics. It is about the narrative. It is about the story the genre wants to tell about itself. Nashville likes stories about rugged individualists. It likes stories about tragic poets. It likes stories about families who sing gospel. It doesn't know what to do with a father and daughter who sang about sleeping around. It remains an awkward conversation. It is a peculiar footnote in the history books, and so Jeannie Kendall remains on the outside. She is a legend to the musicians who know, to Alan Jackson, to Rhonda Vincent, to the bluegrass community, but to the institution she is an anomaly. She is the survivor of an experiment that the industry is happy to forget. The final cruelty is the erasure. Because the Kendalls were an independent act for much of their career, recording for labels that went bankrupt, their catalog is scattered. In the streaming age, if you are not curated, you do not exist. There is no massive Kendalls box set being promoted on Spotify. There is no Ken Burns documentary segment dedicated to them. Jeannie, lacking the legal resources and the business acumen of a major estate, has been unable to consolidate her legacy. She watches as her contemporaries are celebrated and revitalized, while her own work drifts into the digital ether. She is becoming a rumor, a memory shared by older fans in Facebook groups, but unknown to the millions of new country fans. The story of the Kendalls is one of the most singular and haunting narratives in American music. It is a story about the devastating power of a dream deferred. Royce Kendall was a man who wanted stardom so badly that he constructed a vehicle out of the only materials he had, his own voice and his daughter's innocence. He drove that vehicle to the very top of the mountain. He proved the doubters wrong. He became a star, but he didn't calculate the cost of the fuel. The cost was Jeannie's autonomy. The cost was her identity. She was drafted into her father's war before she was old enough to know she could be a conscientious objector. She served with distinction. She was a loyal soldier. She sang the notes he told her to sing. She lived the life he designed for her. And in the end, she was left holding the bag. She was left with the fame that had faded, the money that had dried up, and the grief that had compounded. She was left as the sole custodian of a legacy that was built for two. We often look at gold records and awards as proof of victory, but watching Jeannie Kendall stand alone on stage, singing love songs to a ghost, forces us to ask a harder question. Was it a triumph or was it a heist? Did they conquer Nashville, or did the industry extract the magic from their blood and leave them by the roadside when the tank ran dry? As she sings that famous hook, "Heaven's just a sin away," one wonders if she feels that heaven was ever truly within reach, or if she has been living in a beautiful, melodic purgatory of her father's design all along. So where does this leave Jeannie Kendall today? She lives in a world of echoes. She lives in the home she shared with Mac, surrounded by the artifacts of a life lived on the road. But she is not a tragedy in the sense of a victim who gave up. She is a tragedy in the classical sense, a hero fighting against a fate that was written long before she stepped on stage. She still sings. When she can, she books a show. She gets in the car, drives to the venue, puts on the makeup, and walks out into the lights. And for 3 minutes, when the band kicks in and she hits that high, pure note in "Heaven's Just a Sin Away," the tragedy dissolves. For 3 minutes, Royce is there. Mac is there. The bus is waiting outside. The year is 1977. She is 22 years old. The world is wide open, and the sin is sweet and new. The song ends. The lights fade. The ghost of a harmony hangs in the air for a split second, unresolved. And then there is only silence.